Today's presentation will be all about women displays and the absolutely fantastic exhibit that we have currently up around you. But a brief introduction about our curator, Siobhan. She is our curator of collections with 2 degrees in history from the University of Notre Dame and Loyola University Chicago. She has had positions in various museums before she's come to us, including the Lake County Discovery Museum and the West Chicago City Museum, as well as time at the Anthony Parks McCormick House as the Programs and Education Assistant. She has been with the History Center for nearly 5 years now. My gosh, I can't believe it's been that long. And as the curator of collections, she manages our object and archival collection, coordinates research, and develops exhibits. So she has done the hard work of putting together this entire exhibit, and she has some truly wonderful, unexpected stories for you about the women of display. So please welcome our curator of collections, Siobhan Heraty.
Well, thank you for joining us all today. As Emma said, my name is Siobhan Heraty. I am Curator of Collections here at the History Center, and I am going to be speaking with you today about women in displays history. In our new exhibit on women's history, it goes into a lot more detail than I will be able to get into during the talk today. So before you head out after the talk, I do encourage you to take a look at the exhibit if you're interested in diving a little deeper into the topic than I'll be able to get into this afternoon. And if you do have any questions about anything I talk about today, I will try to answer those as best I can at the end. All right, but the further you go back in time, the more difficult it can be to try to track women down in the historical record. Women's stories in the 19th and into the mid-20th century are often obscured by the customs and laws associated with something called coverture. And according to coverture, when a woman married, her identity was now covered by her husband's identity, so she became an extension of him as far as the law was concerned, and she ceased to be her own legal person. And so since married women in the 19th century could not, under coverture laws, they could not own property, they could not sign contracts, and they were even prevented from retaining ownership of their own wages if they worked, among other restrictions that were placed on them under these laws. So these coverture laws, they kept women from entering the written records because they would not be listed as property owners or business owners, for instance, on some records related to properties and business transactions, even though their work in farms and in family businesses was just as integral to the success of these operations as men. So it can be a little hard to track women down through some of the paper records in that regard. And then when women did appear in the written records in the 19th century, they were more likely to be listed under their husband's name, Mrs. John Smith, for instance, instead of being listed under her own name, Mary Smith. And so this aspect of coverture wasn't the law, it was just the common practice that a woman took her husband's name after marriage, but that can make it hard to determine what a woman's first name was and be able to separate her identity from her husband's. And it can also make it difficult to figure out her maiden name and trace her life before her marriage and figure out what her story was earlier in her life. So that custom of coverture obscures the identity of women in the historical record when they do actually make it in there. But another difficulty of researching women's history is that in the past, even when a woman performed noteworthy deeds, she might only receive a passing mention. And this is the case for Charlotte Misner of Desplaines, who is apparently well known and very respected locally for the volunteer work that she did in Civil War hospitals. But the only appearance that we have found of her in our archives is in the written memoirs of William Thacker, who was a childhood friend of hers. And he doesn't give any details about what it was that she was doing as a volunteer during the Civil War. It's just a one-sentence statement that she volunteered in Chicago hospitals during the Civil War, helping out in those military hospitals, and that's about it. So we have not been able to figure out anything else about her. She remains a bit of a mystery to us, even though she did apparently really great work. So the challenges that things like this present to researching women's history in, especially related to 19th and early 20th century displays, is what makes it actually pretty remarkable that the best eyewitness source that we have for the settlement of Des Plaines in the 1830s are the letters written by a woman to two other women. These were the letters of Harriet Conant Goodenough that she wrote to her sister Fanny Conant Phillips and her best friend Sarah Wadsworth Clark. And Harriet Conant Goodenough and her husband Daniel, and Harriet's parents and siblings, the Conants, they were among the first settlers to come to Maine Township in the mid-1830s. They came here in 1834. And they came here from Vermont, like a lot of early settlers who came to Maine Township did, from New England and the mid-Atlantic states is where a lot of these early settlers came from. And when the settlers arrived in Maine Township, they staked land claims near the Des Plaines River and broke the surrounding prairie into farm fields. And Harriet and Daniel Goodenough, they built a log cabin near the modern-day location of Thacker Street and River Road. And life on the Des Plaines prairie in the Goodenough's time, it was not for the faint of heart. The success of a farm depended on a lot of hard work and the cooperative effort of men and women to make their farms sustainable and profitable. And so during the day, women like Harriet tended their kitchen gardens. They canned and pickled fruits and vegetables, cared for the farm's chickens, milked cows, churned butter. They made soap and candles from tallow, and they butchered, smoked, and salted meat. And they also prepared all of the family's meals. They cared for children. They sewed and mended the family's clothes. They spent a long and exhausting day hand washing those clothes once a week for the family. And they even wove homespun cloth, which could provide an additional source of income for the farm because extra cloth could be bartered for goods and tools that the family needed, or they could sell the extra cloth for cash that could go towards purchasing additional land and livestock. So all of these things that they might be doing at any given day meant that a woman's work on a prairie farm in the 1830s lasted from sunup to way beyond sundown. But the most difficult thing for women settlers in 1830s Des Plaines wasn't necessarily the rigors of establishing a farm. It was the separation from their family and friends that they left behind on the East Coast and the loneliness and isolation that came from living in a frontier settlement. And so on the screen here is what Maine Township looked like in 1841, so just a few years after the Conants and the Goodenoughs came here. And as you can see here, it's really still mostly prairie with some forested area along the river and spots here and there of enclosures where farms had been established. So it was pretty sparsely populated still in 1841, still pretty isolated. And settlers, their only connection from this area here, from this sparsely populated area to their family and friends back east was through letters. But it could take months for those letters to actually make it into the hands of the settlers because there was no post office in Des Plaines in the 1830s. And the closest post office was 15 miles away in Chicago. And settlers from Des Plaines typically only made a trip into Chicago for supplies and other business, like going to the post office, just once every few months, because that was a 30-mile round trip by wagon, which took a lot of time and was not exactly a quick trip either, not a one-day trip, given how long it would take to get there and back and take care of your business. So a letter could be waiting for you at the post office in Chicago in May, but it might not be until July or August that you actually get that mail. So that really did just make the separation and the distance seem even greater than it actually was for a lot of the settlers here, like Harriet and her family. But this isolation, it was not really helped. It was compounded, in fact, by the demands of life on a farm 3 seasons of the year, from the planting season in the spring through the harvesting in the fall. So the Goodenoughs, Harry and Daniel, they were pretty young when they came here to Des Plaines in 1834. They hadn't been married that long, and they didn't have any kids yet. So when Daniel left the cabin to work out on the farm in the morning, Harriet was by herself all day in that log cabin. And in her letters to her sister and her best friend, she made no secret of how lonely she was. But she really did try to put a good face on it to them. And she wrote in an April 1835 letter We commenced keeping house the 16th of December, 1834. You can scarcely imagine how lonesome I was. Our cottage, more than a mile from the residence of any human being. Day after day passed away, and I saw no one except my husband and him only at night. Mother and Rebecca, another one of her sisters, stayed with me some, but when they went away, I was more lonely than ever. But I find people must suit themselves to their situation. This I have endeavored to do, though I do not believe I shall ever think it as pleasant to live alone as I have company. So it's no surprise that the tone of her letters started to change when more settlers arrived in Des Plaines. The Goodnuffs gained Socrates Rand and his family as near neighbors who lived only about a half mile away from them. And Harriet Goodnuff quickly became friends with Socrates Rand's sister, who was also named Harriet, and who was pretty close to her in age. And nearby neighbors like the Rands were really important, not just because humans are social creatures and we like having friends and people to talk to, but because Maine Township in the 1830s, it was really far removed from the relative civilization of Chicago and the settlement that was in Chicago. The neighbors, they would rely really heavily on each other for support. That was the only help you had in an emergency, and you didn't want them to be super far away. So having the Rands a half mile away was really good for the Goodnuffs in case anything happened. But women also, they visited neighbors on horseback all the time to nurse each other through illnesses. They shared food when needed. And Dolly Rand, who is Harriet and Socrates' mother, she was very well known and deeply respected by her neighbors in Maine Township in the 1830s and 1840s for the assistance, the devoted and cheerful assistance that she would provide to anyone in the area who needed it. So the Rands were definitely good neighbors for the Goodnuffs to have. And when the settlement was just a few years old, in 1838, Harriet Rand organized the first school in Des Plaines in the milk and cheese house on her brother Socrates' farm. And Harriet taught about 20 students in the first of the 2 terms that she taught at the school. And the students were both boys and girls from the surrounding area of Maine Township. The fact that girls were attending formal schools in the early 1800s was influenced by the early American principle of Republican motherhood, which was an idea that encouraged families to give their daughters a basic academic education so that girls could grow up to become good mothers who would instill good values in their kids and raise them to be good citizens of this young country. And so even though Republican motherhood principles still did encourage women to remain focused on their roles as homemakers and caretakers, it was Republican motherhood that did begin the gradual expansion of girls' access to education as the 19th century kept on progressing. But in any given year, girls typically attended school more often than their brothers due to boys' commitments on the farms in the spring and fall. But girls typically left school for good at a younger age than their brothers did so that they could help their mothers with housework and care for younger siblings. And also so that they could receive an education in domestic management from their mothers, so they could learn how to run and manage a household and a family themselves. And most women at the time didn't work outside the home. So once a girl learns her basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, most parents wound up pulling their daughters from school so they could learn to be household managers from their mother. And there really weren't a lot of jobs outside the home available for 19th century women. And the jobs that were open to them were those that really perpetuated the cultural norms of the time of women as housekeepers and caretakers. So jobs like teaching, nursing, seamstress work, and domestic service were some of the most common jobs held outside the house by women in the 19th century. But for most women, these jobs really weren't considered a career necessarily. They were jobs that a lot of women knew that they were only going to be holding between leaving school and getting married. But married women, their working life didn't necessarily end at the altar, since women did continue to perform a lot of really important work on family farms and in family businesses. And some women who worked as nurses and midwives before marriage did continue to work as nurses and midwives after marriage when family and neighbors needed medical care. But it was girls whose families allowed them to stay in school that were able to work as teachers. And in the 1840s and 1850s, in Des Plaines, we had a one-room schoolhouse. This was our second schoolhouse that was built in the 1860s, and this one had 2 rooms. We don't have a picture of the first one-room schoolhouse, unfortunately. But it was one teacher teaching a classroom that had a large number of students of all grades and of all abilities. And the teachers weren't required to actually be local to Des Plaines. From documents in our archives, it seems that more often than not, the teachers didn't actually live around here. And some came from areas as far away as Barrington, which was quite a distance in the 1850s to come. So teachers who lived too far away to travel to school every day would board during the week with school families in Des Plaines instead. And throughout the school term, the custom was that the families rotated hosting the teacher for the week, so that by the end of the year, every school family did wind up hosting the teacher for at least a week in their home, which meant that the teachers and the community got to know each other really well. And in the 19th and even into the early 20th century as well, it was common for school districts to require female teachers to resign if they got married. So for a lot of women, teaching was a job that they held for just a few years between finishing school themselves and getting married. But teaching was a really common job for young women in the 19th century, and a very large minority of women did work as teachers at some point. So there were really a very large number of young women in the 19th century who did have the taste of independence that came from holding a job on your own and working for your own wage. So definitely an important experience for a lot of women, even if it wasn't something that they turned into a career long term. And healthcare was another of the handful of occupations that were open to 19th century women, with most in this field working either as nurses or midwives. And traditionally, women were expected to nurse ill family members at home just by instinct, without any kind of training. And they were only expected to call for a doctor in very severe cases for assistance. So working as a nurse was one of those jobs that did perpetuate the 19th century cultural norms of women as caretakers and being those types of positions open to them for work. But women volunteered during the Civil War as nurses in hospitals, like in this illustration we have here. And possibly, actually, like Charlotte Misner, the one woman from Des Plaines that we only have one sentence about her, that she volunteered as a nurse in Chicago Civil War hospitals. But it was women's work as nurses, as volunteers during the Civil War, that really gave nursing a new respectability, because they did very, very well in these positions, and people noticed that. And so that gave this profession, it became very respectable. And as a result of that, the Civil War really encouraged the professional training of nurses. And so nursing schools, the first nursing schools were established in the 1870s, and nursing became an established profession instead of one that women were just expected by instinct to know how to do. So the Civil War did help create this as an actual working field for women. But expectant mothers in the 19th century were typically treated throughout their pregnancies and deliveries by midwives rather than by doctors. And in 19th century Des Plaines, the most celebrated and trusted midwife was Philippine Abby. And Philippine Abby was born in Germany and immigrated to the United States as a young woman in the 1850s. She raised her 10 children in Des Plaines, but she was never too busy to help other women through their pregnancies as well. And her skill, her compassion, and her calm demeanor really gained the confidence and trust of families in Des Plaines. And she was so beloved by the community for her work as a midwife that she came to be known around town simply as Grandma Abby. So she kind of became the town's custodian or honorary grandmother, really. She delivered over 1,000 babies, it's estimated, during her career, sometimes even delivering several generations of a single family. And Philippine usually stayed with a family for a few days after a birth to monitor the progress of mother and baby, and also just to help out around the house while the family adjusted to life with a newborn. And she was usually paid for her services in goods from people's farms instead of cash. So things like potatoes, bacon, and chickens were among the things that Philippine did receive as payment during her career for her midwife services. And Philippine delivered her last baby at age 90, a few years before she died in 1927 at 95. So it was a very long career here in Des Plaines. And there were some women in the 19th century that did forge their own paths and sought out careers that weren't typically open to women at the time, like Jane Rogers Walton of Des Plaines, who became a doctor in the 1870s. And growing up in Des Plaines, Jane was very studious, and she apparently was often found at the head of her class in the Des Plaines schoolhouse. And she actually returned to the Des Plaines schoolhouse for 4 or 5 years before she got married to teach in her old school. And it was when she was working as a teacher that she started to become interested and started exploring studying medicine. But she set both of these possible careers, teaching and medicine, aside when she married Elbridge Walton and turned her attentions to their farm. But Elbridge Walton died young. He was about 35 when he died in 1869, and he had been ill for quite a long time. He'd been declining for a few years. And as her husband's health worsened, Jane wound up taking on more and more responsibilities on their farm. And by the end, she was pretty much running it by herself because her husband was just too ill. And Jane was just shy of 30 when her husband died. And we don't believe that the couple had any children that survived early childhood. So within just a few years of her husband's death, Jane decided to return to her ambition to study medicine. And she began commuting to Chicago to attend the Women's Hospital Medical College, which was later absorbed by Northwestern. And it's when she was going to medical school in Des Plaines that she was actually still, going to medical school in Chicago, excuse me. She was still living in Des Plaines. She was still running the family farm while she was going to medical school. So that had to have been a very demanding schedule that she was following to make sure everything was going well on both fronts. And we have her listed here in this red box in the catalog of students for the medical college from 1872 to 1873. And she graduated from medical school in 1874. And the brand new Dr. Walton, she entered private practice after finishing school. And that was the common choice that was made by a lot of women doctors in the 19th century because they faced really, really stiff resistance to joining male hospital staffs. So private practice was what most of them did wind up going into instead. And Dr. Walton's practice was in Chicago, but she did continue to live here in Des Plaines for a few years. But her practice wound up being really successful. And so the demands of her patients caused her to leave her farm here in Des Plaines and move into Chicago by 1880. And she died in 1887 at about 50 years old. And after her death, her alma mater, the Women's Hospital Medical College, they memorialized her, saying that Dr. Walton was a woman of considerable business ability, making her practice financially successful as well as professionally so. So she did very well in medicine in the 19th century. But Dr. Jane Rogers Walton was a little bit ahead of her time, but she probably would have found some like-minded women in the generation that came of age in the 1890s, just a few years after her death. The 1890s were a really interesting period for American women because this was a transitional period for women from the focus that was placed on the home in the 19th century to the more public role that women played in the 20th century. In the 1890s, women began making progress towards the improved access to education, the more varied and fulfilling employment opportunities, and the greater personal and political freedoms that they would achieve in the next century, in the 20th century. And the feminist ideal of the 1890s was called the New Woman. The New Woman was educated, she was confident, she was daring and active, and she pushed against the limits that society imposed on women, and she sought greater involvement in that world outside the house. Young women challenged this new ideal by taking to the streets on bicycles and entering the workplace, prepared with a better education than what was achieved by earlier generations of women, including their mothers. And the poster girl, so to speak, for the New Women was the Gibson Girl, as illustrated in the popular cartoons by artist Charles Dana Gibson. And a lot of his illustrations were published in magazines in the era, just like these two were. And these show the Gibson Girl, the New Woman of the Gibson Girl, left as a very stylish woman, but who enjoyed a life of outdoor pursuits and enjoyed a much more active lifestyle than earlier generations of women did, and liked to go hiking in the mountains and things like that, pursuing an more outdoor life. And then in the illustration on the right, Charles Dana Gibson, a lot of his cartoons had a bit of a humorous bent on them, and this is one of them, this cartoon titled The Weaker Sex, in which you have 4 of the Gibson girls examining a miniature man and trying to poke him with like a butterfly pin and pin him down to study like he's an entomological specimen. So there were a lot of his cartoons that were a little funnier and had more of a humorous take on subverting the whole notion of women as being the weaker sex, and this is one of a series that were on that topic that he had. But the bicycle is another symbol of the New Women, just like the Gibson Girl. America was just in love with bicycles in the 1890s, thanks to the invention of the safety bicycle a few years earlier in the late 1880s. And safety bicycles are very similar to the style of bicycle we ride today, and they were a lot safer and easier to ride than the high-wheel penny farthings that had been popular a little bit earlier. And the design of the bicycle meant that women could actually ride them, which they couldn't with those high-wheeled bicycles. The safety bicycle had a much lower profile, which meant that a woman could actually swing her legs over the bicycle frame in her skirts and be able to get up on that seat. And the bicycle, they wound up giving women a freedom of movement that previously wasn't really available to them. Thanks to the bicycle, women no longer needed a man's help to hitch a horse to a wagon to travel. They could just hop on the bicycle and go, powered by their own body. So this gave women greater independence than they'd previously had, which boosted women's self-esteem and self-confidence. And things like the bicycle in the 1890s actually wound up empowering women to challenge their traditional role in American society and seek greater rights, like the right to vote. And the importance of bicycles in the 1890s is really hard to overstate. There are a lot of full-length books that have actually been written on this topic. And we even produced a short documentary on it for our YouTube channel, so check that out on our websites. If you're interested in learning more, just to shamelessly plug one of our own projects here. But there were a lot of prominent women in the 1890s who praised the bicycle and its positive impact on women. And Susan B. Anthony has a quote that I think sums it up very well. She said, "Let me tell you what I think of bicycling. I think it has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance. I stand and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel." But it wasn't just young women who could be considered new women in the 1890s. Their mothers were also influenced by this feminist ideal and sought to improve themselves and take on a more active role in society through women's clubs. And women's clubs formed organically, almost in a grassroots way, all across the country in the late 19th century, and the Des Plaines Women's Club was part of this national trend and was first formed in 1894. The women's clubs that organized in the late 19th century were originally formed as study clubs that chose to focus on a topic of interest to their members, usually history, literature, or arts. And these were subjects that a lot of the women who were joining women's clubs at the time may not necessarily have had the chance to study in school, since these women had varying levels of formal education and they didn't necessarily finish school themselves, actually. So when the Des Plaines Women's Club was formed in 1894, they described the club's goal as the intellectual improvement of its members in their constitution. The club studied American history and literature, and they had members select discussion topics for each meeting, and they rotated as discussion leaders at their meetings on those topics. And so the women's clubs of the late 19th century, they had a very deep impact on the women that were involved, and by extension on their communities as well. Club membership gave women confidence in their ability to affect positive change in their own lives by embarking on this journey of self-education. And the leadership and administrative skills that women gained from club membership also helped women to develop their talents and gave them the confidence and the skill sets that they needed to affect change in their own community. And this was an era in which most married women did not work outside the home or the farm, so these skills and the confidence that women gained from women's club membership were kind of a big deal. And it was after the turn of the 20th century that many women's clubs, including the Desplaines Club, broadened their missions from intellectual improvement of club members to the improvement of their hometowns through community service. And the early years of the 20th century were characterized by a period of activism and political and social reform that historians call the Progressive Era. In which this time they aimed to clean up the corruption, the excesses, and the inequalities of the late 19th century's Gilded Age. So there were a lot of reform movements that were going on at this time, and two very prominent progressive era reform movements were the women's suffrage movement and the temperance movement, which called for the prohibition of alcohol. And women were the driving force behind both of these activist movements at the time. And these two movements did ultimately achieve their aims in two consecutive constitutional amendments that were ratified in consecutive years. The 18th Amendment marked the beginning of Prohibition in 1919, so the temperance movements, they achieved their goal with that amendment. And then the following year, the 19th Amendment in 1920 gave women the right to vote, so it marked the success of the women's suffrage movements. But it's unclear where women in Desplaines fell on these two very prominent issues of the time. We know that women in Desplaines probably held very personal beliefs on these topics, either in support or in opposition, that went unrecorded on paper in documents in our archives. So we do not know for certain what women's level of activism in these two movements was in Desplaines, but undoubtedly they had thoughts. Desplaines women's activism in the Progressive Era is actually very visible at a really local level. Through the reorganization of the Desplaines Women's Club in 1912 from a study club to an organization that had two goals. The first was still the intellectual improvement of its members, but the second was the betterment of civic conditions. And the Women's Club leveraged their influence in town to get litter out of downtown Desplaines. They lobbied the Chicago and Northwestern Railway to put lights on the station platform for safety, which you can see in this photo on the left from 1918. And they also got a public drinking fountain installed in front of Village Hall, which is in the circle on the right there. And they achieved quite a few other projects, but these were three of the really big ones that they got a lot of attention for. And it was in 1902, actually, that Desplaines women gained greater access to education with the establishment of Maine Township High School in 1902. And before 1902, Desplaines students who wanted to continue on past 8th grade had to travel by train to Jefferson Township High School, which was located in today's Jefferson Park neighborhood of Chicago. So that was quite a commute for a teenager to make to go to school at the time, and so that did present a big barrier to a lot of Desplaines students from going to high school. So when Maine Township High School opened in Desplaines in 1902 on Thacker Street, right across the street from where our Central School is today, that made it a lot easier for Desplaines students to stay in school. And the young women of Desplaines really took advantage of this opportunity. And in this photo from the class of 1906, more than half of these students were women. The guy who's in the middle on the far left with the mustache, that's one of their teachers, so he doesn't count in the total. And this class of 1906, they would have been freshmen in 1902, so they were the first class to attend Maine Township High School for all 4 years. And in 1906, when these young women graduated from high school, they would have been considered very highly educated for their time as high school graduates. And as high school graduates, if they wanted to get a job after graduation, their diploma qualified them for jobs that did require a higher level of education. So jobs like clerical assistants, which was a newer field for women at the time, working as typists, stenographers, and secretaries, that's something that was now open to these women. And they could even prepare for these jobs by taking commercial classes at the high school and have a little bit of a leg up in the working field in that regard. And one Maine Township high school student who did take advantage of these commercial courses was Mabel Steel Key from the class of 1921. And she grew up on a farm on Milwaukee Avenue in an area that was called East Maine at the time, but is now part of Niles today. And her dad was an officer in 2 Cook County farming organizations. And her parents hoped that Mabel going to high school and taking shorthand typing and bookkeeping classes at the high school would mean that she could help her father with his work once she finished. And initially, her parents planned for her to leave school after her sophomore year, but one of their family friends was Dr. Clarence Earle, who was the school board president. And he encouraged her parents to let Mabel stay in school and finish her high school education. And when she graduated in 1921, which she actually did in just 3 years instead of 4, she was the first girl from the rural East Maine area that did earn a high school diploma. And she did, as planned, help her dad out with his Cook County Farming Organization administrative work after high school, but she also wound up putting those skills to use in a career of her own. She wrote for 25 years a weekly column on East Maine news for the Cook County Heralds, which is today called the Daily Heralds. And so one of her columns from 1938 is there on the right. But other young women who graduated from Maine Township High School also sought out work as typists, stenographers, and secretaries, which were among the most sought-after positions for educated women in the early 20th century because the working conditions in an office were a lot better and less physically demanding than factory work, domestic service, and working on a farm. So Des Plaines women that were looking for these types of clerical positions benefited from the easy commute by train into Chicago, just like today, really, where a lot of these positions were available for women in offices downtown. And just before World War II, a woman from Des Plaines named Louise Huck Milano, she did just that. She commuted from her parents' home here in Des Plaines to her clerical job in an insurance exchange building office in the city. And so we'll hear a little bit more about Louise in a couple minutes and what she did after this clerical work in the city, so keep her name in mind. But another lucrative opportunity open to women in the early 20th century was working as a telephone operator. And in this photo, the 4 women who are standing on the porch of the Des Plaines Telephone Company office were the company's 4 operators in 1916. And by 1917, the year after this photo was taken, 99% of all operators nationwide were women. And telephone companies preferred hiring women as switchboard operators because they believed that women would provide better, friendlier customer service than men, and they also believed that women would be less likely to talk back to their customers than men working as operators, and so that's why telephone company directors preferred hiring women as operators at the time. And as telephones became more and more common in the years after World War I, as more homes, more businesses got telephones installed, the job market for telephone operators just kept on expanding throughout the 1920s, providing women with a new job opportunity and a lot of chances to actually break into it. So those were 2 of the newer job options that were available to women in the early 20th century. Women still did work a lot, of course, in jobs like teachers, nurses, and domestic servants. But in addition to all of these types of jobs women could have, there are also a couple of women from Des Plaines who were very successful in the arts and entertainment world in this time. And so from 1924 to 1934, Bess Flynn, who's here on the left, she lived in Des Plaines. And Bess Flynn was a pioneering radio show writer and actress. And she wrote and starred in Painted Dreams while she was living in Des Plaines, and Painted Dreams is considered radio's very first soap opera. And in radio's earliest years, women like Bess, they did hold prominent positions as producers and presenters for radio programs, but really just for a few years, unfortunately, because by the late 1920s, station owners started limiting women to working with soap operas and on music programs. And they justified this scaling back of women's opportunities by citing polls that stated that audiences preferred men's voices to women's on the radio. But Bess Flynn, her biggest hit was a soap opera called Bachelor's Children, and that premiered actually the year after she moved away from Des Plaines. But Bachelor's Children and their cast is in the photograph on the right. It was a show that followed the life of fictional bachelor Dr. Bob Graham after he became the guardian of a deceased friend's nearly grown daughters, one of whom he later wound up marrying on the show. But the show's plot lines included just the gamut of soap opera tropes. It included kidnapping plot lines, amnesia plot lines, and a lot of cliffhangers. And it was really very successful. It ran for 11 seasons. It was nationally syndicated on both NBC and CBS at different points in its time on the air. And Bess Flynn was the only writer that the show had in those 11 years. So she did have a very long career and was apparently in the history of early radio a very well-known name. But Des Plaines was also home around the same time to a professional musician named Doris Stockton. And Doris was known as the First Lady of Marimba. She grew up here in Des Plaines playing the piano, but when she was a student in high school in the 1930s, she turned to the marimba, which is a percussion instrument similar to a xylophone. And her musical career took her all over the world. She performed at Carnegie Hall and the Hollywood Bowl, among a lot of other really well-known venues. And she played as a guest soloist with ensembles like the New York Philharmonic and Guy Lombardo and his Royal Canadians. And Doris, she retired from performing in the 1960s, but she decided that in her retirement, she would go back to school and continue her education. And she graduated first from Oakton Community College in 1984, and then from California State University Dominguez Hills in 1995 with studio arts and piano performance degrees. And so among the pivotal events for women in the 20th century was World War II. And like the 1980s, the 1940s, especially the World War II years, were a transitional period for women and marked the beginnings of some big changes for them that happened in the second half of the 20th century. And during World War II, women greatly contributed to the war efforts. They volunteered with the Red Cross, organized blood drives, put together care packages for troops, collected scrap metal for salvage drives, and served in newly formed women's branches of the military. And when men left for military service, women filled gaps that they left behind in offices and on factory floors. And there were 2 war production factories that were local to Des Plaines and that employed a lot of the city's women during the war. And women built, from Des Plaines, women built airplanes for the military at the Douglas Aircraft Company factory at Mannheim and Higgins, which stood on the sites of the northeast corner of O'Hare today. And women also worked at Benjamin Electric at Northwest Highway and Seegers Road, building alarm horns and lighting devices for the Navy. And in the photo at right, Jean Spafford, a Maine Township high school student, is building a hand lantern for the Navy at Benjamin Electric in 1945. And on the left, we have a photo of some of the interior assembly work on planes that women were doing at the Douglas factory in 1944. And it was the Douglas factory that was the largest of these 2 employers. Douglas employed 16,000 people at their factory during the war, 6,200 of whom were women, so more than a third of that factory workforce during the war were women. And women worked at that factory in really every department, from administrative clerical office work to manual labor positions in assembly departments, like this department's photographed here installing throttles and things like that in the fuselage in the cockpit. But at Douglas Aircraft, Benjamin Electric, and a lot of other war production factories all across the country, it was women working in these jobs side by side with men that broke down gender barriers in the workplace. And this time in the World War II workforce, it was transformational for a lot of women. And before the war, they were expected to leave the workforce when they married and turn to homemaking instead. But in the decades after the war, the number of women in the workforce only grew as women's educational and professional horizons just kept on broadening. Oops. There we go. But women also supported the war efforts through service in new women's military branches that placed women in administrative and support positions so that male service members could be freed up for overseas combat service. And there were two women from Des Plaines who joined new women's military branches, Betty Jo Streff Reed and Louise Huck Milano. And both women grew up on Prairie Avenue in Des Plaines. And Betty Jo, who we have here on the screen, she initially worked at the Douglas Aircraft Factory at Mannheim and Higgins, building airplanes. But when she was building these planes at the factory in her time off, she was learning to fly planes at Pewaukee Airport in Wheeling, which is Chicago Executive Airport today. And in 1944, Betty Jo left Douglas, and she joined the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs. And during the war, she served at an Army airfield in Mississippi. And WASPs, like Betty Jo, the type of work that they did during the war freed up male pilots for combat service overseas. And so WASPs ferried planes from manufacturing plants to military airfields and ports of embarkation. They wound up helping with troop training by towing targets for anti-aircraft artillery practice and simulating strafing flights, so troops knew how to react in those situations. And they also transported supplies across the country in cargo planes. And some of those cargo planes were probably the C-54 transport planes that women like Betty Jo helped build at the Douglas Aircraft Factory that was just outside Des Plaines during the war. And Louise Huck Milano, who was one of the women who worked in the clerical field in Chicago, commuted to a job in the Insurance Exchange building in the 1930s. She left that job in 1944 to join the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. And Free a Marine to Fight, on the photograph at right, was the very simple but really successful recruiting slogan for the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. And the Marines made use of Louise's clerical experience, and they assigned her to work as a record keeper in property accounting at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. And Louise enjoyed her time in the Marines, and when asked about it, she said that the Marines were strict, but I enjoyed it. My mother was stricter than they were. And so the war highlighted the capabilities of women and the contributions they could make to society. Holding down a war job, managing a family while a spouse served in the military, and even serving in the military herself, like Betty Jo and Louise Huck Milano did, that gave women a new perspective and an appreciation of their abilities and the contributions that they could make. And so when the war ended, women didn't necessarily return to that pre-war place they had in society, and a lot of them decided to stay in the workforce after the war. And by 1947, there were actually more women employed nationally than at any point during the war. And so their opportunities only grew with the expanded access to education that women received in the decades after the war, which wound up opening a lot of career doors to them that had been closed to earlier generations. And Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 was really a big thing in opening those doors for women. Title IX is often cited as leveling the athletic playing field for women, promoting equal representation of women's sports in school athletic departments, but more importantly, Title IX leveled the academic playing field for women. because Title IX guaranteed women's access to equal education by prohibiting sex-based discrimination in any school or educational program that received federal funds. So before Title IX, some colleges and universities prohibited women from enrolling in certain fields of studies, like science, or from even applying to law and medical schools. So Jane Rogers Walton, our 1870s doctor from Des Plaines, she had to go to the Women's Hospital Medical College in Chicago, which was a school strictly for female medical students because most medical schools of her time barred women from applying. And so if she was a medical student really just almost exactly 100 years later, in the 1970s, thanks to Title IX, she would have had more of a choice in attending medical school and would have had a very different career trajectory. So this was something that really did remove barriers for women, Title IX, and broadened women's educational horizons, opened these doors to them beyond the traditional women's fields of teaching, nursing, and clerical positions. And the feminist movement of the era also influenced young women as well, inspired women coming of age after World War II to really have some new dreams, dream of new possibilities for their careers. And so with an equal education, they were able to successfully compete for jobs in fields that had previously been dominated by men. But women did still experience resistance to their entry to male-dominated areas, as Des Plaines resident Nancy Faust discovered during her first season as Comiskey Park organist. And during the 1970 season, which was Faust's first working with the White Sox, a group of disgruntled fans circulated a petition calling for her removal as the ballpark's organist, because they believed that a baseball club had no business hiring a woman who they believed had no knowledge of baseball. They did not think a woman should have such a prominent position at the ballpark, and the White Sox did not pay any attention whatsoever to that petition. And Faust wound up winning fans over very quickly with her interactive style at the organ, which some fans have compared actually to scoring music for a movie soundtrack, because she paid very close attention to what was going on during the game. She knew what was happening in baseball. And she listened to the radio while she was at her organ in the ballpark so she could play songs that reflected what was happening on the fields. Her classic example being her choice to play Steam's Na Na Na, Hey Hey, Kiss Him Goodbye, whenever an opposing team wound up pulling their pitcher from the game. And she lived in Des Plaines for almost half of her career with the White Sox. She retired from playing at the ballpark in 2010, and when she retired, she was profiled in Sports Illustrated, ESPN, and major publications like the Washington Post and New York Times for really being a groundbreaker in bringing music back into the ballpark. So she had a very long, very illustrious career. And so since World War II, in post-war Des Plaines, there were several women's groups that were organized in the community. And after the war, a lot of young families were moving out of the city into the suburbs, like Des Plaines, attracted by the good schools, houses with yards, quiet neighborhoods. But it was after these families settled into their new homes in these brand new post-war subdivisions that the neighborhoods really were a little too quiet for the women who wound up being left at home after their kids left for school and their husbands left for work. And removed from the vibrancy and the nearby social networks of the city, of urban life, a lot of women experienced loneliness and isolation on this new suburban frontier, just like Harriet Goodenough did when her family moved to Des Plaines in the 1830s. And in 1960, a few women living in the Wayson Park neighborhood realized that if they were lonely, other women in the subdivision probably were too. So they decided to form a neighborhood social club that would meet in members' homes so the women of the neighborhood could get to know each other. And within a few years, the Wayson Park Women's Club shifted their mission to philanthropy and fundraising, just like the Des Plaines Women's Club did in 1912. And they also wound up using their time and their skills to benefit their community through service to the community. But this wasn't the only women's group that was organized in Des Plaines in the decades after World War II. Local chapters of national organizations that aimed to advance and empower women, like the American Association of University Women, the League of Women Voters, and the National Organization for Women, were all formed in decades after the war. They established local chapters here in Des Plaines. And we have some photos from two of those groups here on the screen. The American Association of University Women in the 50s, in the 40s and 50s, organized a summer school every year for the children of migrant farm workers that came to this area when we were still a very agricultural community. And then we also have a photo on the bottom from the 1980s of some women from the local chapter here of NOW, the National Organization for Women, at the March for Women in DC, representing the local group here. But women also entered government in Des Plaines in this period. In 1965, Eleanor Rohrbach, who is seated on this stand-up bicycle with the Des Plaines mayor, in 1970s. In 1965, Eleanor Rohrbach, she was not happy that there was only one person running for the office of city clerk. She thought that the people of Des Plaines deserved to have a choice of candidates, and she decided to do something about that by entering the race herself as an independent. And Eleanor Rohrbach described the city clerk's role as the city secretary and said that the post should be held by a person with a background of secretarial, financial, and administrative experience, rather than someone with political experience. And her opponent in the race was a former alderman. And Eleanor Rohrbach, in her campaign, she cited her background as a bank loan officer, a secretary, and as PTA delegate to the school board as excellent qualifications for the job. And the voters of Des Plaines agreed, and they elected her as city clerk in 1965. And she was reelected 4 times during her career, and at several points, locals speculated as to whether she would run for mayor. But she died suddenly in 1981 from a brain aneurysm, and she was eulogized in the Chicago Tribune by Mayor John Seitz as knowledgeable, caring, and very energetic. She was one of the most valuable people in the city. And so as we move into our own century, a clothing designer, businesswoman, and Des Plaines native named Eileen Fisher is still making a mark. She launched her socially conscious clothing brand in 1984, which is sold today in Eileen Fisher retail stores and in department stores nationwide. So Des Plaines women's history, it is still unfolding. It's still being written. And if you're interested in more details and more stories of women in Des Plaines, then I do encourage you to take a look around our exhibit before you head out today. The exhibit will be on display through the end of this year, so still a lot of time to check it out if you don't have the time this afternoon. Thank you.